Welcome. Welcome to this interactive conversation. I'm just going to put myself on speaker view so I can see myself better. So this conversation, as you're probably all aware, is called Deep Adaptation, Deep Transformation, or Both. And in it, Rupert Read and I will be discussing probably one of the most important themes of our time, even if, or maybe especially since it's not what you read about in the daily headlines of your news feed every day. And I thought just as a way, as a kind of context setter, just to highlight this, and here we are all, obviously, every one of us bringing in, we're reading about what's going on in Ukraine and feeling all kinds of appropriate, strong senses of what a terrible events are unrolling here. And some of you might even have missed this very week was one of the most major reports from the Ipcc that's ever been issued, which kind of got pushed down the headlines, talking about the fact that it's already too late to turn around some of the excesses of climate breakdown. And the authors actually made it in a statement to say, targeting a climate resilient, sustainable world involves fundamental changes to how society functions, including changes to underlying values, worldviews, ideologies, social structures, political and economic systems, and power relationships. This is from the authors of the Ipcc report, unanimously approved by 195 nations. And yet, that's not what we read about in the headlines. So this is what we'll be discussing, the implications of this today. And let me just introduce Rupert Read, and then just a few words about my own background. Rupert has been at the leading edge of engaging with these themes over the past few years. He's a reader in philosophy at the University of East Anglia. He's been a spokesperson for both the UK Green Party and Extinction Rebellion, and has been instrumental in the Deep Adaptation movement that was founded by Jem Bendell in 2019. And in fact, last year, Rupert and Jem co-edited a collection of essays called Deep Adaptation, Navigating the Realities of Climate Chaos. Thank you, Rupert. And he's recently initiated a new project called Transformative Adaptation, designed to accelerate building resilience in response to this systemic climate and ecological collapse we're looking at. And for those of you who don't know me, I write about the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis, and I explore pathways toward a life-affirming future, in particular, the vision and tangible possibility of an ecological civilization. And just quickly by background, back in 2019, I actually engaged in a written dialogue with Jem Bendell as he founded Deep Adaptation, critiquing aspects of that and calling for what I called at the time, deep transformation, which is actually the name of the new network that is kind of hosting this discussion today. And this is not meant to be a debate between me and Rupert. We're really entering into this live conversation publicly with the shared intention to build a deeper collective understanding of how to respond to this civilizational emergency. Could not be a more important question in my mind. So as we're talking, we're going to be talking in dialogue for about 30 minutes. Feel free to pose questions you might have in the chat. And if you see one you like, upvote it or whatever. This is being followed in a live Twitter feed. And if you're watching this on Twitter, you can also actually ask questions live. If you do ask a question on Twitter, add the hashtag WHICHDEEP. WHICHDEEP. And that way it'll get picked up and the question can make it into this conversation. Well, hopefully we'll have a good 30 or 40 minutes of Q&A after Rupert and I have just been talking directly. So as we go into this now, what I'd like to do is maybe turn to you, Rupert, asking you if you could just help to get some context setting here. When we're talking about the need for this adaptation, we're talking about this dire situation. Could you maybe give us a little bit of a clearer picture of how you see this global situation unfolding right now? And why do you see it as being dire, or whatever you describe it as?
Yeah, Yeah, so let's start from the IPCC report, Jeremy, which you rightly highlighted, which unfortunately hasn't got quite as much attention as it should have done, given the world geopolitical situation. I'll come on to that in a second. This IPCC report is yet again the scariest yet. There's innumerable things in it which are deeply worrying. This report is on adaptation. That's what it's about. It's on adaptation, resilience, and vulnerability. So it's incredibly timely for our conversation, let alone for the planet. I was an expert reviewer on the report, and so I've been familiar with a lot of what's in it for quite a while. And one thing I'd like to highlight, which was highlighted at the press conference that launched it, was that it's quite smartly written, this report. The IPCC have gradually been sort of upping their game in terms of becoming a little bit sort of communications savvy. So, for example, they use quite a lot of clever metaphors. One which I really like, one I've used before myself, is the atmosphere is on drugs. The atmosphere is on steroids. So you should expect it to be pumped up and hyped up and with a higher temperature and with a bigger bang for its buck. And all of that is very bad news for humanity. Having said that, and if you've taken in some of the news coverage of the report, I would like to say that even now, it's less bad than it used to be, but even now the IPCC reports are slightly off the pace in terms of where the situation really is at. That's partly for no fault of their own. These reports are always, of course, out of date by the time they come out, because they've literally taken years to put together. These reports go through a kind of process of sort of consensus molding, and they have this thing in them where they say we have high confidence in this, medium confidence in that, low confidence in the other. That can lead people to sort of dismiss or put to one side the low confidence results, but that's really a mistake. If we're coming at this from a precautionary perspective, some of those kind of outlier possible events, some of the consequences of our recklessness are actually deserve to be taken extremely seriously. There's other things I could go into, but I'll keep it brief. The brief version is that even now, not as much as before, but even now, the IPCC reports should be taken as a sort of baseline, not as a kind of, this is as bad as it could get or something. Really, it's like the dire things that they're saying, this is about as good as it can get. And from, as I say, from a precautionary perspective, we should actually have the expectation that things may be worse than some of the worst case scenarios, so-called, in the report, let alone than just if you just only take the things they have high confidence in. So my own view is that actually we're considerably more vulnerable even than the impression that's been given by most of the news coverage of the IPCC report. And now connecting that with the geopolitical situation, basically everything that is important about the Ukraine situation is connected with what we're talking about here today. Ukraine is a major breadbasket of Europe. That may be one motivation for Putin's actions. Russia is, of course, a petrostate. That's where it gets its power from. When you support the gas and the oil industry, you're literally supporting the war on the Ukraine. And perhaps most crucially of all, if, of course, we had properly mitigated and adapted years ago, we would not be now dependent. And by we, I mean especially us in Europe, but it's also America too. America is also receiving gas from Russia. We would not be now dependent upon Putin's petro power. And that really just underscores the absolute importance this year, right now. This is a unique moment, a moment we should seize. A unique moment to potentially pivot. The great importance right now cannot be overstated of moves towards energy efficiency, demand reduction, things like better house insulation, etc. These are things that can be done pretty quickly, unlike bringing on line new nuclear or, for that matter, fossil fuel power. And there are things that absolutely must be done if we're to avoid being over a barrel from Putin next winter, and if we're to get anywhere near the kind of trajectory we need to get on in order to avoid cataclysm. But cataclysm is to some extent here already. More of it is coming. It could be that a lot more of it is coming, and the Ipcc only really scratches the surface. And that's why, although my diagnosis of the situation is not quite as categorical or devastating as my colleague Jem Bendel's, that's a key way of understanding why I think we need to have a strong deep adaptation perspective. And let me just explain that very briefly, and then I'll go back to you, Jeremy. What I mean by a strong deep adaptation perspective is that I'm not in favor of putting all our eggs in the basket of deep adaptation. As you've mentioned, I'm also strongly in favor of transformative adaptation. We'll come on to that in a minute. But what I do strongly believe is that it is no longer rational to believe that there is no chance of societal collapse driven by ecology and climate in societies like ours. And as soon as you think that there is some reasonable chance of such collapse, then it seems to me you have to engage in some deep adaptation as an insurance policy. And that is the way I think that all rational people should now think of deep adaptation, as an insurance policy in case of the worst occurring. Whether you think that that worst is certain or likely or merely possible, or indeed already underway, any of those make it rational to include deep adaptation in your arsenal of responses,
Yeah. Thanks, Rupert. I follow every aspect of what you're saying. And the one thing I would add is, even though, of course, the focus of attention is on climate, because climate is the most extreme and most obvious way in which we have been screwing up our whole home that we all live on, we need to recognize climate itself is just a symptom of a deeper underlying crisis that we are engaging in. So that even if there were some magic bullet, which we all know in this room here that there's not, but even if there were, and we could solve the climate crisis with some sort of new fusion energy or whatever comes down the pike, all it would do is push the can down a little bit further to a far greater systemic devastation that we're on, which is this ecological collapse we're driving our society into. And we're looking at things like in the last 50 years alone, 68% of animal populations worldwide have been demolished. We've lost most of the animal populations worldwide in just that time. And we're looking at mainstream economists look at tripling the amount of production and consumption that has already caused so much damage over between now and 2060. That's the kind of reason why I absolutely share with you, Rupert, Jem Bendel, and others, the sense that we are headed like at a rapidly increasing rate towards this increased possibility of collapse of our civilization. So that's where I feel we share the context. I think what is a rich place for us to explore in this conversation, what I think people, everyone who's aware of these things is grappling within themselves is, so how do we respond to this? And part of the reason why I wrote the critiques I did to Jem Bendel's original article and the kind of deep adaptation movement is not that I disagree with a lot of the diagnosis, but there's sort of subtle distinctions which I think become very profound in people's minds, which have to do with the sense of one is inevitability versus likely or a real possibility. And that's in itself is a big distinction. We just all been watching, or many of us probably watched that Don't Look Up movie over the holidays, where now if there was an asteroid like we're seeing in the sky hitting us and we've got nothing to do, that's a time in my mind to deeply adapt, to sit there like in that whatever the scene and be with your family and just recognize spiritually, be open to collapse. I don't feel we're even close to that place right now. And I feel that the ways in which we engage, the tonality in which we engage is what's crucial. But at the same time, where I agree so much with Dem and you, Rupert, and others, is that there is this kind of hopium that goes around. There's this techno-optimism, the sense that we read about, like in progressive newspapers like The Guardian or whatever, almost every day, like there's still a chance if we can look at what we're doing with renewables, look at what we're doing here, and we've got to invest in this stuff. But we need to recognize this, the problems are far more systemic than almost anybody is looking at, which is why my focus is on the deep transformation, because it's only by recognizing the depth at which we have to shift society that we do have a possibility, in my view, of changing trajectory.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to be willing to look reality in the face, and our love affair with technology and with science makes it difficult for us to do that. Obviously, in saying that, I'm not at all saying that that green technologies, etc., are not part of the solution, let alone climate science, which is absolutely vital. What I am saying is that, as you say, Jeremy, if we look to those for our salvation and not to anything deeper, then we are in very, very serious trouble. And that's one reason why I suspect we are in very, very serious trouble, because as I see it, and I'm partly coming at this as a philosopher with a background in Wittgenstein, as I see it, we live in a profoundly scientistic society, and that's true even today. There's a kind of very widespread science worship, and some of the kind of anti-science stuff that you're also seeing in recent years is a sort of reaction, a sort of extremist reaction against that science worship, a stupid reaction. But the science worship is not something to be welcomed, and it's not surprising that it breeds that kind of reaction in some places. So absolutely, we need to have a transformation that is profound. I see some signs of that transformation in its early or possibly mid stages. As someone who is a student of Joanna Macy, I agree with Joanna Macy's judgment, however, that kind of transformation and that what she calls great turning, nowhere near enough of it has happened yet. It's not happening nearly fast enough, and it is not going to happen at a pace to save our current civilization. In saving that, I don't mean to claim that collapse is inevitable, as Jem has often claimed. And indeed, one of the reasons I agreed to edit this book with Jem was precisely because we wanted to make clear that to be signed up to the deep adaptation agenda, you don't have to believe that societal collapse is inevitable. But what I do think, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, what I do think is that it is clear that our current civilizational model is bankrupt. And as you say, we need something which amounts to a paradigm shift. The only way we get through this without collapse is by such profound transformation that what comes out the other side looks very little like our current civilization. And that's the reason why I make the claim in the title of another of my books and one of my most well-known talks, that this civilization is finished. That's what that claim means, that we only get to avoid collapse by transforming in such a way that our civilization is no longer the same civilization in any meaningful sense. Now, if we start to come to the question of what you're trying to get at, which is how do we aim at something which is not collapse, which I think is great, and I do think it's really important that we have something positive to aim for. My way of framing that is with this idea of transformative adaptation. Which is a concept which has its pedigree in the United Nations and in academia. It's developed by the think tank I used to chair called Greenhouse, for example, in our book, Facing Up to Climate Reality. And now I'm trying to, as you kindly mentioned, push it forward more widely, and as something which I'm hoping is going to be kind of ground up and bottom up and widely understood as a frame for what we need going forward. And I'm inclined, so what I think is that we need deep adaptation and transformative adaptation. Deep adaptation is like the safety net. Transformative adaptation is what we're trying to do, is what we're positively aiming at. there's a huge overlap between transformative adaptation as a kind of spin, if you like, on the kind of thing that the Ipcc have been saying this week and trying to radicalize that further. There's a huge overlap between that and what you call deep transformation. But I do have some concerns about the deep transformation framing. So I'm just wondering if we should take a few minutes to think explicitly about these framing questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so let me put my key concerns. So the reason for the conceptualization of deep adaptation, which Jem came up with, is because what we have had to date in the adaptation field, not very much, frankly, but what we've had has been reasonably characterizable as merely defensive, trying to defend our current civilization, which is
right.
Defensive, incremental, and shallow. And obviously there's an allusion to the wonderful old philosophy of deep ecology in saying, well, what if we were to have a deep version of adaptation instead? And the contrast is clear between deep and shallow adaptation. Now, the framing concern I have about deep transformation is that it's not clear that that kind of parallelism works, because it's not clear what it would mean at all to talk about shallow transformation. So can I put that question over to you? What would shallow transformation be? And if it's not clear what it would be, then why does it make sense for us to talk about deep transformation?
Yeah, I like that. Well, that's a great question. And what comes to my mind really might be that we can think of, if there is such a thing as a shallow transformation, we can think that maybe along the lines of a transformation within a part of the system that doesn't actually mean a transformation of the entire system. And so this actually goes along the lines with a model of change that some people in this group might be familiar with, which is known as the three horizons model of change, which is a simple idea. If you imagine you're kind of walking along in this unknown territory, and the three horizons relate to a first horizon, which is like just kind of looking at the steps you're taking right there, making sure you don't trip over. The second horizon is like what you can see at the horizon. And the third horizon is something beyond. And the notion of that is that when I'm talking about deep transformation, I'm talking about actually recognizing that we need to move to that third horizon. It's even like far beyond what we're looking at right now. Shallow transformation, if we want to sort of come up with that term, is a little bit like that sort of second horizon thinking. And in real life, what that refers to is, imagine something like, for example, Tesla, within the auto industry, it's transformative. Everything's different. It's a totally electric vehicle, which does just everything that the old fossil fuel ones did. Exciting. It's a transformation, but it's a paradigm shift, but only within one part of the overall system. What we need to look at is that the capitalist system, and I'd like to bring in this term, this elephant in the room that often just gets ignored, because to me, this is what it's about. We live in a system of global capitalism that is fundamentally based on extraction and exploitation. That is the basis of it. And it's based on what I look at a lot in my writing. It's based on this underlying worldview that humans basically are separate from nature. The nature doesn't actually have any intrinsic meaning or value in itself, that humans are also separate from each other. And so everything about our life is meant to be to improve our status and wealth at the expense of everything else. When I'm talking about deep transformation, I'm talking about looking at what it would be like to build a civilization on a fundamentally different basis of what is actually life affirming. Actually, imagine a civilization based on setting the conditions for flourishing for all humans on a regenerated earth. That's deep transformation. And that's what we need. And of course, people can say, we don't have time for that. We're already heading towards the precipice. My point is that is the only way we can actually begin to turn this juggernaut around, is by actually shifting the very direction itself, not just kind of making a few incremental steering adjustments so the angle with which we hit the collapse is a little bit more oblique.
Yeah, okay. So the point then would be that transformation has to be, profound, has to be, well, I would say has to be genuine, really. And that's what we're aiming at then is an ecological civilization. Okay, I still think that it's a bit unclear whether it would really make a lot of sense to talk about shallow transformation, but I do see what you're positively aiming at. And I guess my response to that, and why I'd still kind of lean towards the transformative adaptation framing rather than deep transformation, while recognizing there's a huge amount in common, basically aiming to do the same thing, is that what I'm very keen to emphasize is that we're well past the point where we can get through what's coming. And in fact, the Ipcc report for the first time said this, in any kind of smooth or serene kind of transitional way. Yes. There's going to be a lot of pain. There's going to have to be a lot of adaptation to our vulnerability, to disasters, etc. And that adaptation is going to have to be ongoing and open-ended, because we've introduced instabilities into the climate system, and indeed, as you say, into the broader system of biodiversity, which are going to last for centuries. And it's going to take a long time for them to play out, even if as humans we get our act together, which we don't show a great deal of sign of doing so far. So for me, a virtue of the transformative adaptation framework is that it's a more decisive break with the hopium, which you rightly criticized earlier. And one slight worry I'd have about the deep transformation frame is that it might encourage people to think all we have to do is, it's absolutely vast thing we have to do, but all we have to do is change our paradigm and then everything's going to be fine. Whereas my thought is something more along the lines of, we are entering into a profound time of testing for humanity. This time is going to be in many ways horrible and disastrous. There are going to be more and more disasters for a long time to come. There is going to be a great deal of pain. There's going to be a great deal of psycho-spiritual pain. And one slight place where we may differ is that while I agree with you that we have to have something positive to aim at, and my frame for that is the positivity of the transformation that's obviously present in the concept of transformative adaptation, what I also think is that we should be very open and explicit about the fact that we have to reap the benefits, if you will, of the negativity too. We have to, I think that by really feeling and facing the psycho-spiritual pain, for example, we can potentially grow. And here again, I'm very much drawing from my teacher, Joanna Macy. I think that when you look at the history of disasters, there's something very encouraging about that history, that often what happens is that people become stronger through facing the survivors, through facing those disasters together, and through building new communities in those. So what I would say is that, following the great German poet Hölderlin, where the danger is, there lies the saving power, that it may be that our greatest opportunity now is to reap the painful learnings from disasters, from our own psycho-spiritual sufferings, from facing what we're doing to other animals and so forth on this earth. And that to get the positive, if you will, we may have to go by way of that negative. And I think that the concept of transformative adaptation is helpful in getting us to that point, and might be more helpful than the deep transformation framework. But over to you. What do you think?
Yes. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And as you're talking, a couple of kind of themes come to my mind. So I'd like to touch on one, and then to the more spiritual aspect of what you've been touching on, Rupert. The first thing, I guess, is, to be honest, one of the biggest kind of gut responses, negative response I had to the deep adaptation frame to begin with, is the sense that oftentimes when we look at adaptation, it gets to be very easy to look at our local adaptation and begin to kind of close the barriers around us. And from the global climate justice perspective, probably the vast majority of people in this meeting room right now are from the global north and are relatively well able to look after ourselves up to the point of a total utter collapse of everything to do with civilization, which we hope and pray will never actually be experiencing because of the disaster that means. But then people in the global south right now, the majority of the world are actually facing some version of that collapse, either right now or fairly soon. And so a part of what I feel is so important to get it clear, and even if we are talking about deep adaptation, is we in the global north, who are the ones who are actually reaping the benefits, the material benefits of the destruction that has been done historically to the Earth system. We're the ones who have an obligation to actually reinvest what we have to the global south to actually help them to adapt. So even then, yes, I see it about transformation. It's about transforming our entire economic global system to actually funnel the funds where they're needed the most for the adaptation that is required. So that's just one global point. But let me just kind of bring it more into our sort of spiritual place right now, because I do very much feel aligned and attuned with something that I do see coming out of Jem's writing, your writing, and writing of people like Sean Kelly and Joanna Macy on these issues, that we just to focus, just to say, no, I'm not going to go to that bad stuff. Let's focus on the good. That doesn't do justice to the depths of what we're looking at. We have to recognize we're looking at, in some ways, a greater devastation, a greater atrocity than any human beings in all of human history have ever had to look at. We're looking at not just a genocide taking place or something like that. We're looking at a genocide of life itself that's taking place. We're looking at this very, very real possibility that any positive thing that humans have done over tens of thousands of years might get lost in a total civilizational collapse. We're looking at the fact that we are destroying so much of what nature has built up over hundreds of millions of years, this abundance, this beautiful world we've inherited. And anyone who has looked at that deeply knows that it gets to be this abyss. It's like almost like too much to touch into. I've certainly felt that. And that's where I feel we have to acknowledge that. And Joanna's work and others' work is so important about recognizing we need to be in community with that. We need to share that grief, that ecological grief, which is not just, ecological grief is not like some sort of, grief about what's happening out there. It's a profound grief, profounder than almost any other kind of grief there is when we recognize our identity as being part of life. So I'm so with you there. But I feel that, to me, and I've struggled with this question myself, and what I've come to in my own understanding, and this is just my personal way of coming to that, is I feel what life wants from me is to feel into that just enough to let it energize me, to let it like give me like rage and engagement, but then not so much that it gets me into this place of unlimited grief and just turning into the spiritual aspect of where it means without moving into engagement, without saying what life really wants from each of us is to feel that and then give ourselves to the transformation we need to try to save what we can.
Yeah. Wow, thanks, Jeremy. That was really rich. And, at a fundamental level, we're very aligned there. I mean, just that stat you gave us earlier, right, which gets me every time. For each year of my life, more than 1% of the world's wildlife has been destroyed. It's just,
yeah.
There's sort of nothing to say in a way. You have to contemplate that. I agree with you about the profound importance of not getting stuck permanently in that place. But, maybe it's a slight question of kind of, if we try to kind of bring it down to brass tacks of sort of timing. The way you made it sound just now, I don't know, you made it sound something like you should stay there for a few hours or something, possibly a few days. I think kind of sometimes it's good to be there for weeks. I had a wonderful student on a class I taught a few years ago. One of the people in the class said to me, Rupert, you're telling us this really, really difficult stuff. And I just feel inclined to despair when you tell it to me. And this wonderful student piped up and said, what's wrong with despair? He gave us a big smile. And I think what he was saying was, look, sometimes it's actually necessary to stay for quite a while in, the worst feelings of all, like despair or eco-depression. And it may be that only that gets us where we need to be. Because you know what, Jeremy, what I really believe about this, and what I've had some experience of in some of my own teaching in the last few years, what I really believe is that when we really allow ourselves to go very deep, and sometimes that means staying there quite a while, we start to encounter a kind of power and energy that is much greater than we previously believed possible. I think we've seen the first glimmers of that, really. I think there's so much more. I think we've seen the first glimmers of that great, utterly profound energy and power in Greta Thunberg and some of her colleagues in the school climate strikes and in Extinction Rebellion. And it's awesome. And when you start to see it and really experience it for yourself, you become almost scared about what may be possible for us to do. And I think we're going to go so much further with that in the 2020s. And that's what we need. That's what I see as being the energy to power the transformation that both you and I are talking about. And I would argue that it only comes if you're willing to let yourself go quite deep, potentially for quite a long time. Let's remember, for example, Greta Thunberg didn't speak for a year because she was so depressed about the situation. And out of that came this absolutely awe-inspiring, world-changing movement. It may be that some of us need to go to that kind of level to get to where we need to go. And in terms of how I see this, coming back to your remarks about adaptation, again, I'm in fundamental sympathy in terms of how I see this playing out in terms of something like transformative adaptation. So adaptation needs to be just. One of the big problems I was at the COP in Glasgow in November, one of the really big problems with the COP process and with the way that the rich countries have tried to play the climate issue is that they are focused so strongly on mitigation, on prevention, which sounds like a great thing. And of course, in some ways it is, but in other ways it's not. If it occludes the damage, the vulnerability, and the requirement for adaptation. And my strong belief is that the reason why adaptation has had such a short straw so far in climate policy and in climate activism until very recently, I think there's two main reasons. The first reason is that when you start talking about adaptation and doing adaptation, then you can no longer avoid facing up to the fact that the crisis is real. Whereas actually, if you stay wholly in the realm of mitigation, if you're talking all the time about net zero 2050 or even net zero 2030, you're still basically kind of implying to yourself and to others, it's not quite here yet. Whereas adaptation is, no, it's here, it's right now, and we've got to stop ourselves getting more vulnerable. The second reason I think that adaptation has been a poor relation is because there's such a need, as you said, there's such a need to adequately fund adaptation in poorer countries. But to put it very bluntly, rich countries don't want to do that because they don't see any benefit from it. Whereas they do see benefit from getting poor countries to mitigate, because everybody benefits when the atmosphere is not overloaded further with CO2. So you see, it's a very kind of brutal realization. The reason we've been focusing so much on mitigation is that it benefits us and benefits our children. And of course, that's what we need to be doing, is taking care of our children and thinking genuinely long term. But if we're not thinking about adaptation and doing it right, which means doing it justly, as you say, and doing it transformatively, plus a side order of deep adaptation. If we're not doing those things, then we are shortchanging right now the people of the global South.
Yes, yeah, I hear what you're saying on that, Rupert. And I want to come back to this question that I feel everyone probably sits with in this conversation, about this question of despair and the place for that in what we're doing. And then after that, I think perhaps we can look at maybe moving to invite questions into this room, so that there's so many people with so much to say on this. Well, to me, I do feel it's important. Like my own perspective, I'd want to emphasize to everyone in this room is everyone has got their own path. You know, for some people, it might be like Greta Thunberg or others, it might be a year or more just spent in this place of silence and despair. For other people, it might be a day spent like that. And however it is, and for, well, speaking for myself, it's not like I go there and then I never go back to it. I'm always teetering. I'm right on the edge of what feels like despair. Every time I look at this situation that is actually unfolding and where we're headed. And what I feel, to me, I try to go, it's almost like a little bit like navigating, sort of skiing down. So like just curving into it enough to get the energy from it, not so much to then get sucked into it. Because to me, what it seems to be about is not being attached to outcomes. None of us know what will actually happen. If I had to put odds on it, I would put odds that we are headed for some absolute disastrous collapse, that maybe some of the elites in their gilded lifeboats might maintain some version of something else. But we're not, it's not looking good. But there is, whatever there is a possibility of, that's what I feel is what we have to give ourselves to. It basically, it's like diving into the mystery of this recognition. We live in these incredibly complex nonlinear systems. None of us know when the next Greta Thunberg type of person might come, only this time might be somebody from the global south, somebody who then brings hundreds of millions of people to get energized in a way we haven't seen yet. And we can't just rely on any one person. We have to realize that each of us is actually setting the conditions for that kind of person to arise. It is a part of human instinct is to follow somebody who gives them inspiration or whatever. But it's also, we are actually all co-creating whatever does happen. So there does seem to me to be like, the more I look into the despair, the more I look into the desolation where we're headed for, the more I feel that is life calling me to say, whatever it is that I can do, whatever each of us can do is required. Not because I know what's going to happen, but because I know I'm alive right now and I can do this. And if any of those of us who are in the place of more privilege, where we have the freedom and power to do that, that's what we're being called on, in my view.
Yeah, I strongly agree. I resonate with that profoundly. Let's go to questions in a moment. Just very briefly, in response, I would say we badly need scenarios that are not just scenarios of a non-believable, shiny tech sci future where we colonize the solar system and everything's fine. And we badly need scenarios for futures which are not just apocalyptic meltdowns and everything's gone. We need futures that are to be imagined, that we can see, that we can start to try to contribute to, which are in between those. But what I would again stress is that I think there's a balance here. On the one hand, one wants to make those futures be as attractive as possible, as well as possible, if you see what I mean. On the other hand, I think we have to be very realistic about the pain that we're going to have to go through to get there. So again, this is why I say, let's get real about the adaptations that we're going to have to make of all kinds, practical kinds, spiritual kinds, etc. Let's not shy away from the horrors at any point, the horrors that are here, the horrors that will be coming. Let's instead embrace them, if you understand my meaning, as the fuel that we were speaking about a minute ago. And let's make sure that when we are asked for hope, often I'm asked, can't you give us more hope, and so on, that we ask the kind of tough questions that need to be asked around requirements for hope. Hope for what? So is it rational, for example? Does it make any sense now to hope for the continuation of our current civilization? No. We've got to always ask, hope for what? We've got to also make sure that we're living in the present, and that we're not kind of putting all our eggs in the basket of a supposed better future, which may or may not come. I agree with you totally about not being attached to outcomes. And finally, I would say that while hope has to be active, otherwise it isn't really hope at all. It requires action. It can't just be a passive attitude. We also should have a preparedness for failure. This is the complexity of my message. My message is less simple than Jem's message, and perhaps less simple than your message. I say we have to be willing to do these two things at once and try to combine them. We have to be aiming for a better future and at the same time preparing for the potential of a really, really difficult future. I think we must do those two things at once, otherwise we're likely to be caught short.
Yeah, thank you, Rupert. I follow every aspect of what you're describing there, and perhaps now might be a great time to open things to some of the people who've been part of hearing this conversation. And David Ashton has a great question. I don't know, David, if you're there, if you're in the actual Zoom meeting, I wonder if it would be possible to spotlight you and have you ask that question to us directly, or if not, I can read it out. But do we have David available? Okay, great. Hi, David. I think you have to unmute yourself and then.
You're still muted.
Oh yeah, you have to, let me just ask you to unmute.
Right. Nope.
You're still muted.
Okay, sorry, I've got it in the end because I was clicking unmute, but I had to click something else. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan, can I say, of both you, Jeremy, and Rupert Read. But what I feel really quite emotional about this evening is that we're a middle-class group of people talking about spirituality and all the rest. And don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely with you there. But what we've actually got to do is address capitalism. Mm-hmm. So my question is, if capitalism is the elephant in the room, what are we going to do about it to get it out of the way? Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know how many people have read Jason Hickel's book, Less is More. I thoroughly recommend it for I thoroughly recommend it for everybody who hasn't read it. And he's not alone. I mean, there's, I don't know, just recently, I also followed Timothée Paric, the French degrowth guy. And he's, well, he said, look, if you're a bit bored, here's about 27 books, I think. So back to the question, sorry, you know, what is the best way of overcoming capitalism? Because the current lot aren't going to change. You know, they've got the power, they've got control of the media. And finally, you know, Jason Hickel is saying the only way we're going to do it is by involving workers in the unions. Yeah. There I mentioned truckers in the United States, you know, which I had a lot of time for. And they were, of course, assassinated for being racist and a minority group and all the rest. But that is, they have power and we don't. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, thanks for asking such a key question. Let me say a few words, but then really want to put it over to you, Rupert. I think you've been more engaged in some of these frontline questions, I think, even more than I have. But to my own perspective is that, we have to recognize this system. It's a system where the global corporations, the elite, control every aspect, whether it's the media, the finance, the politics, and we're not going to get that change from the top down. And elections we've seen in most so-called democracies are getting to be, hard to, I still believe we need to engage in the elections, don't get me wrong, but they're not going to give us the kind of change that we need. It's got to come from grassroots, and it's got to come from a massive mobilization of people power that we haven't even come close to seeing yet. But it's also got to come when we saw things like the Occupy Wall Street movement, and a lot of the critiques of what went wrong with that is they didn't have an alternative to put in their place. So as much as it's ultimately got to come from the energy of the grassroots, we've got to have a vision that grassroots set of people who are discarding the received ideas of the past can actually move toward and say, this is what we demand, this is what we need, this is what we move towards. That's where I feel many of us in this kind of conversation can really make an impact. But I really want to turn to you, Rupert, because you've had so much experience in both the positives and the frustrations of exactly this question.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. That's very kind. And yeah, it's such an important question. We could discuss just this question for the next few hours, really. So I'll have to try to be succinct. The first thing I would say is I very much agree that capitalism is a structural problem that makes it virtually impossible, let's put it that way. To make the kind of progress we need on the fundamental questions we're talking about this evening. And one aspect of it I'd particularly like to highlight is that capitalism is an engine for inequality. And I mean by that chiefly economic inequality, which in numerous ways is an ongoing engine of destruction of our world, in the commoditization of it, in the creation of envy, in the creation of unnecessary needs, non-genuine needs, wants that pretend to be needs, the ideological genesis of needs. And for me, this is an absolutely fundamental question. And to be honest, I don't think it's getting enough attention. I think that we have reached a point where we've been bamboozled, actually, I think, by capitalist ideologues into thinking that this is not true, and that if we focus on the various other things that divide us, such as gender and race and sexual orientation and so forth, and if we get those right, then we'll essentially have solved the problems. But we could actually have a society which is truly gender blind, and race blind, and has no homophobia anymore, and so on. And if it still has the fundamental economic inequalities of our current society, then we're still royally fucked, and so is the planet. So I just want to make that slightly old-fashioned point, if you will, in favor of a kind of Marxist element to our analysis. We have to be willing to talk about and do something about economic inequality. Otherwise, we're absolutely nowhere. Finally, let me say something about what we can do. And I'm going to kind of float a kind of suggestion that I've been making in some of my writing over the last year or so now. And it's this. We've all been so inspired in the last few years by our children rising up. I mean, it's shaming, really, that they've had to do so. And so kind of moving and sad and wonderful all at the same time. But they've shown us something by going on climate strike. That's what they call it, climate strike. Right. Mm-hmm. The question I love to ask people now is, well, if our children can go on strike, then why can't we? And what I strongly believe is that in the next few years, and it might even start now with this energy crisis around the Ukraine war, that in the next few years, there will be developments, there will be moves in some industries and some workplaces, etc., to try to get more or less bottom up, real climate and eco action occurring, real transformation to business models, to what's happening in workplaces, etc. And if that is resisted, then what I want to say to people is, if you're trying to do that, and I think if if a lot of people on this call wanted to do a lot of that, that would be a fantastic way forward at this point. If that gets resisted, then it seems to me that's the moment to start thinking about calling the kind of strikes in workplaces that we've seen in schools. And that can be possible for all sorts of people in all sorts of places in all sorts of countries, including the USA. There are things that you can do in unofficial walkouts, half-hour stoppages, symbolic strikes, etc. There's lots of things you can do before you go to a full-scale, like general strike or something like that. Anyway, that's a kind of direction of travel I want to see us going in. If we're serious about questioning capitalism, and at this point we should be, and if we're serious about saving the planet for ourselves and for our fellow beings, which obviously we should be, then we will be willing to contemplate and go down the road of that kind of tactic before too long.
Yes, yeah. I think that is a pathway towards that potential transformation, like striking, because people need to recognize that they do have that power when we engage in groups. And one thing I do want to focus on, and then I think it might lead to there's a question that Catherine Alexander has asked. Maybe we can ask Catherine if she would like to actually ask it in be spotlighted and ask it herself. But I want to kind of point out one important thing that for me, when I critique capitalism, and when in this conversation we critique capitalism, I think it's very important not to get stuck in the old paradigm that's been going on now for 100, 150 years of, oh, it's like capitalism versus socialism. And so, is it like more, you're talking about more state power than entrepreneurs? Look what capitalism's done for us, and all this kind of stuff, because that is the old way of thinking. Actually, a lot of communism and socialist thinking for the last 150 years has been just as ready to destroy the natural living earth. It's just been a matter of, well, who gets to have what share of the pie and who gets to decide how the pie is carved up. We're talking about something different. And when we're talking about something like an ecological civilization, it's important to realize that those old right-left divides become essentially meaningless. We're talking about a very different kind of thing of putting power down to the grassroots, and of living, actually doing our economy, our business, every aspect of what we're doing in a fundamentally different way that is life-affirming. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. And maybe, and I also see some hands up, maybe if we can, if Catherine is available. Great. Do you want to ask that question? And then we'll go to one or two of those hands that are up too. Catherine.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I have to say, I appreciate both of you very, very much. I love what you're saying, and I am bored to tears. I am so frustrated because I feel like we're talking about a situation and saying it's urgent, we got to do something, and we have no idea what to do. I'm not getting any direction, anything to do. And strikes are great, but let's be real. They're a long-term solution. They're not going to, we need to change now. We need to do things now. I think when I look at promoting life and when I talk to people about loving life, I have never met anybody who says I don't like life or I don't love nature. But when we look at how we act, it's totally different. And so I think sharpening our vision, changing our personal life, really being able to see where we get off the tracks. And for me, looking at systems thinking and indigenous wisdom are the only two places that I've seen that help us actually shift, actually change what we're doing. And for me, I would love to be in a community where we're helping each other do that. Where we're talking about those very specific things, how in our life, how to understand problems that we have from this new perspective so that we're switching. And I'm not hearing that. I'm just hearing lots of, gee, it's going to change and it's going to be horrible. And that's all true. But I want to know what to do.
Jeremy, can I just very, very quickly come in? How many people have heard of a exceedingly good podcast called What is Politics? It is absolutely excellent. I think we all need to go and
perhaps David, perhaps if you could actually put that in the chat for people to link to, that would be great. But let's make sure we have other people's voices heard on this, because we have heard from you already. But Rupert, I think you were going to respond to. Yeah,
well, I just wanted to respond to Catherine's heartfelt question, and obviously I empathize very much with the frustration. So in the work I've been doing since I moved on from Extinction Rebellion a year and a half ago, I've been arguing that there are really two key locations in our lives where deep change of the kind that we need can occur. One is in our geographic communities, and I think that's more what Catherine is thinking of. And the other is in our workplaces. And I would just like to underscore the importance of our workplaces. And again, I think this is a point where Marx was kind of basically on the right track and is still very relevant today. Sometimes in countries like the US and the UK today, I think we underestimate the importance of our workplaces because there's been systematic propaganda encouraging us to underestimate it. Capitalist propaganda, essentially. But our workplaces are still the places where most of us spend most of our time. Quite literally. Obviously, more of us are working from home now since the pandemic, but that's a borderline case. If you're working from home, that's actually your workplace, and you've got a kind of hybrid workplace between your home and whoever is your employer. So workplaces are fundamental, but geographic communities are fundamental too, and that's where I think I'm strongly aligned with what Catherine is saying. In the absence of sufficient government transformative action, we have to start undertaking the work of transformative adaptation, and I would add of deep adaptation. And that means things like creating and enriching communities that we are a part of, and trying to get them to start to model the kind of world that we want to see. And there are, of course, all sorts of organizations that have been trying to do this for a long time. What I think might be new in the situation that we're in now is that, as well as those organizations and people doing permaculture and the transition towns movement and so forth, there is now a greater sense of urgency, which again, obviously I heard in Catherine's question quite justifiably. And that is, I think, what is leading to movements like transformative adaptation and like the climate emergency centers. And like Trust the People and what the collapsologists are trying to do in France. And that's what we need. That's one of the main things that we need. We have real power on the ground to live differently if we do it together. It's not, I'm not talking about, individualistic preppers or even, homesteaders or whatever, that can be a good thing, but that isn't going to be enough. What might be enough is if you get lots of communities starting to actually try to transform the way they live on the ground and not being prepared to take no for an answer. And that's where I think we need to learn from, for example, Extinction Rebellion. If we're going to succeed in transforming adequately over the next decade or so, we're going to have to do it sometimes in the face of opposition from governments, etc.
Yes, yeah, well said, Rupert. And one thing I would add about this question of, again, that frustration. I'm so glad you gave voice to that, Catherine, because I think all of us feel that at different levels at different times. Like, where the hell is the change happening? And we need it right now. And one of the things that I have to remind myself, and I'd remind all of us, is this recognition that we live in this incredibly complex, interconnected system. And it's a system that none of us alone are going to actually have meaningful change on by just the stuff that we do. It's so big, it's so complex. But that doesn't mean that we then just say, it doesn't matter what I do. What we need to realize is the actions that each of us take that don't even seem like they're actually having an impact can have these multiple ripple effects, which we can't even begin to fathom. Sometimes the things that look like they're really effective actually just kind of ripple out and become meaningless a few days or months later. Sometimes the thing that just a passing comment or something we do, we have no idea that inspires somebody who then moves to this or that other level of transformation, which then begins to shift the whole this whole movement. Remember, what we need is, when I talk about deep transformation, from a complex systems point of view, we're talking about the shifting in the very coherence of a system from one to another. That happens through lots of little changes happening until the conditions for that emergence are ready to take place. When it happens, it can be incredibly rapid. It can blow our minds as to what's actually changing. But and we can look at somebody who might have been the catalyst for that change, like a Greta Thunberg type person or somebody else. But we need need to realize that's actually not the point. The point is the change that each of us were doing together to set those conditions. And we need to look at it in different scales, in my view. We have to start from within ourselves. We have to decolonize our own minds. We have to recognize that the ways in which each of us is actually interacting with the world is part of laying down that future that we need. We need to basically go from a place of love of life and love for others around us and not othering other people. Because as soon as we do that, as soon as we look at the enemies of change and all that rest of it, we're actually helping that worldview of separation to maintain itself. But it's not enough to just stay within ourselves. We have to look at community interaction. We have to be part of in our workplace, in our community. And even that's not enough. We have to engage in these bigger political structures. And we have to engage in elections, even if it might seem like it's totally not worthwhile. We have to be ready to support movements like Extinction Rebellion or others that may arise in the future and get behind them. And because those are the movements that ultimately will have the potential to lead to the transformation we want. So we need to realize every one of our steps, every day, every action we take matters in terms of the transformation we need.
Yeah, agreed. And I'll just read out a tweet which is relevant to what you've just been saying, Jeremy, from Claire McElvenna. Given the gravity of recent weather events and global events more generally, for example, flooding, COVID, Ukraine, do you think that people are now more receptive to the less is more paradigm? I think this is already happening, albeit slowly, which is an intriguing kind of encouraging suggestion there from Claire. I guess my answer would be something like, yes, I think it is, but way too slowly. And one of the things which does depress me somewhat is the extent to which the concept of economic growth and GDP still has a kind of grip on our intellectual culture and is only being chipped away at very, very slowly. Although one interesting point to notice is that the idea of degrowth was included in this Ipcc report that was published on Monday for the first time. Mm-hmm. So something's happening there, but goodness me, it's a transformation, if it is one, that's happening at a snail's pace. What do you think on that, Jeremy?
Yes, well, I think when I look at all these whole set of global events, all the climate disasters and Ukraine and everything else, I think of it in terms of this image of the unraveling of a system. And the unraveling of a system is terrifying, and it also is where opportunity lies. And it's a little bit like a sort of geopolitical version of what you were saying earlier, Rupert, about the energy coming from the grief, from the recognition of the loss. But in this case, like if you're looking at, say, a rug that you want to like change the pattern, you want to tear it, you can't. It's really tightly connected. But imagine this rug beginning to unravel. As it unravels, the very weave of it enables you to reweave something else. And to me, this is the fundamental challenge we have over the next few decades in this, our global civilization, is to reweave this civilization from within. So it doesn't actually collapse, but it actually transforms with actually its very nature. So the unraveling itself does represent an opportunity. And don't get me wrong, I'm not happy to see every one of these terrible events and the pain and the suffering and death and destruction they cause. But we need to recognize that it's in that people stop believing in a system that is causing this destruction. And that's why it's so important that we give those people a sense of you're right to stop believing. And here is something else to turn to that actually does work. Like an ecological civilization, donut economics, different ways of looking at business, commons-based approaches to things. Got a brilliant technological idea? Nothing wrong with technology. Just don't build it within the capitalist framework. Don't build it to try to be the next billionaire. Open it to the commons. That's what is this kind of third horizon, deep transformation way of looking at things. So I'm just also noticing it's about 9 minutes past the hour. We were going to go till about 15 minutes past the hour. So I think we do have time for a couple more questions, unless Rupert, did you want to?
No, let's definitely get a couple more questions in. We've got a question from Carla Gomez. Can you go, Carla?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
I posted a few comments, so I'm not sure about the specific question right now, but I think it's regarding capabilities, the basic needs and capabilities that we need to support a new approach to human flourishing. So I've been trying to explore, from the academic perspective, and I would like it to be more and more practical in the future, what are the basic capabilities, which is a concept from human development scholarship, but I have been trying to integrate it with adaptation to really try and to identify, understand what we really need in terms of our emotional needs, material needs, and also our capacities, our abilities, but we need to develop to rely more on in the near future in order to adapt to the critical situation in which we are in, but still have a notion of flourishing, because that seems to be something that we humans really need in order to move on. Thank you.
Great.
Rupert, what do you think?
Let me start with that. Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're doing important work, Carla, and hopefully we'll hear about it more as it develops. I'll just home in on one aspect of what you've asked there, which is that I believe that the deepest need of all that we have is for meaning, and that's one reason why I'm a fan of Jeremy's work. And also why I'm influenced by the work of Viktor Frankl with his great book, Man's Search for Meaning. And I think that a key upside of the terrible downside that we are experiencing, and that we're going to go on experiencing for some time to come, is that it provides us with precisely that opportunity for a deeper sense of meaning that our culture has been lacking in. And I think that as we go through the maelstrom of the next generation, and as we have to start to adapt to the weather which is spinning out of control, and to the difficulties we're probably going to have with food harvests over the next generation, those kinds of challenges, massive challenges, I think that we're going to be, in our very buffetedness, we're going to be able to find meaning potentially. And this is something which I think we can all build on and take away from the conversation that we're having here this evening, is that if this search for meaning, for how we make sense of our lives at a time when we're putting life in question, where we're putting the web of life in question, if this search can itself be something that is then enriched and becomes more focal and gives us a greater sense of meaning than just the next sports car or mobile phone or the next celebrity or whatever, well, then that's something really profound and to be welcomed, and that we could and should build on long lastingly. But Jeremy, you're the real expert on meaning. So what do you say?
Yeah, well, I do believe that actually meaning does underlie this deep transformation I'm talking about. We have to really change the ways in which we get meaning from our lives. And once we do that, we get to this notion, really, like Jason Nichols said in his title, less is more, that actually the material search for status and all that stuff is essentially takes away from meaning. And we can realize that this other life, and this is one of the things I think is so important for people to realize, there's a positive. It's not like we have to accept the loss so much as we have to recognize that the loss of something that is this hedonic treadmill that is destroying our well-being allows us to actually open up to a far better civilization that's actually available to us. So I think that's where I'm noticing that the time right now is basically right when we were going to stop. So what I'd like to do, I'm seeing so many wonderful questions, and other people want you to share insights and reflections on this conversation. So as we close right now, I'd just like to introduce, so some of you already know it and are on it. If you're not, then this actual conversation was hosted by the Deep Transformation Network. And perhaps we could put in the chat the link to that. And we'll be putting the recording of this conversation on that network. And I invite everybody to actually really continue this conversation in comments on this network. So we can see this not as a basically 75 minutes that then kind of closes something, but 75 minutes together today that really opens a deeper investigation into some of the most important questions in our lives right now.
Yeah, and maybe I could just add to that there's certainly some good conversations going on there on the network. I've seen some of them already. And that if you've appreciated some of what I've been seeking to bring to our conversation here this evening, and again, perhaps these can be added into the chat now, then obviously you may wish to find out more about or get involved in deep adaptation or in transformative adaptation. And I guess that my emphasis, going back to one or two of the questions earlier, would be I think it's a time for us to be getting out there and doing some of this stuff. And those adaptation frameworks provide a way for potentially doing some of that. But there are many others, of course, and many of you will already be involved in others. But I would like to just underscore in closing the importance, as I see it, of adaptation at this time. I think that the struggle to define adaptation is going to be the defining struggle of the 2020s. If it gets defined as shallow defensive adaptation, as people wake up more and more to what's happening, that will be catastrophic. It must be transformative, as we were saying earlier, it must be just. And I would say also there needs to be some deep adaptation too, because to end on a somber note, Jeremy and I, one of our key points of agreement is that the prospects right now don't look great. So I think it's vital to aim at transformation, and it's vital to have some kind of insurance policy.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rupert. And as we close right now, I would just basically want to give voice to so much of the questions and the feeling tone I've picked up from the group, which is to recognize that, it's not just enough to talk. And I saw Tom McDougall talking about just this, are we just in this echo chamber? We need to get this out into the media. Mainstream changes have to take place. Every one of us is part of this unfolding future. So I invite you to continue in this conversation and to look into what are the changes that you can be doing right now? Where are the places where you can be making a difference, recognizing you may not notice, there might be small things, but they're all part of this movement, global movement of millions, hundreds of millions of us towards what we need. So thank you for taking part in this, and look forward to seeing what arises on further in the conversation on the network. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's been good.
Take care.